The fetal membranes, sometimes called the extraembryonic membranes, are tissues that form in the uterus during the first weeks of development and develop along with the growing embryo. These are the amnion, the yolk sac, the chorion, and the allantois. And each of these membranes starts out as a thin sheet of tissue that surrounds a fluid-filled cavity. The first membranes to form are the amnion and the yolk sac. At the beginning of week 2, the embryo is not quite an embryo yet. It's just a blastocyst. And the blastocyst is partially embedded in the endometrium of the mother. The blastocyst has two parts, an outer cell mass called the trophoblast, and an inner cell mass called the embryoblast. The trophoblast is divided into the cytotrophoblast, which forms the wall of the blastocyst, and the syncytiotrophoblast, which is outside the wall and invades the uterus. The embryoblast is a bilaminar disc, with a dorsal epiblast layer and a ventral hypoblast layer. During day 8, a tiny space called the amniotic cavity forms between the epiblast and the cytotrophoblast. The epiblast cells migrate to form a thin membrane called the amnion that surrounds the amniotic cavity, which separates it from the cytotrophoblast. During day 9, hypoblast cells start to migrate to form a thin membrane lining the rest of the blastocoele, which forms the walls of the yolk sac. The yolk sac fills with fluid, called vitelline fluid, which washes across the embryo and nourishes it during this early stage. So basically, by the middle of the second week, the two-layered embryonic disc is sandwiched between the amniotic cavity and the yolk sac. By day 10, some epiblast cells differentiate into extraembryonic mesoderm, and they settle between the amniotic cavity and the yolk sac, and where the cytotrophoblast is located, eventually creating a thick layer of extraembryonic mesoderm tissue between the two. Then, over time, a space starts to form within this thick layer of extraembryonic mesoderm. The cells migrate either towards the amniotic cavity and yolk sac side, or towards the cytotrophoblast side, leaving behind a space in the middle. This space is called the extraembryonic coelom, or chorionic cavity, and it continues to expand until there's eventually just a thin layer of extraembryonic mesoderm cells lining the amniotic cavity and the yolk sac and the lining of the cytotrophoblast. The one spot where the cavity doesn't form is at the body stalk, which is where the embryoblast still remains attached to the wall. At this point, the wall is composed of a layer of extraembryonic mesoderm, then cytotrophoblast, and finally syncytiotrophoblast. And together this is called the chorion. Now, the chorion develops chorionic villi, which are tree-like projections that invade into the endometrium of the uterus and break it down for nutrients. And eventually the chorionic villi help form the fetal part of the placenta. During week 3, the embryo changes its shape. It folds along its two axes and goes from looking like a flat disc to a curved tube. So at this stage, the embryo looks a bit like a shrimp. The folding also pinches the yolk sac so that it looks like a balloon that's squeezed through a ring. The part of the yolk sac that goes within the embryo is called the gut tube, and it becomes the digestive tract. The narrow portion is the vitelline duct, and the remainder keeps the name the yolk sac. Finally, the last of the fetal membranes, the allantois, develops as a tiny outpouching from the rear part of the gut tube called the hindgut. The allantois is a thin tube that grows up toward the umbilicus, and behind it develops the bladder. The allantois becomes a canal through which urine can exit the bladder before the urethra develops. Between weeks 4 to 8, the amnion starts secreting a lot of amniotic fluid, and this causes the amniotic cavity to swell and fold down and around the embryo. So it becomes a fluid-filled sac that protects and insulates the embryo. Eventually, the amnion and the chorion fuse together and form the amniotic sac. Meanwhile, during week 4, the allantois, the vitelline duct, and the body stalk combine to form the umbilical cord. Over time, the nutritious contents of the yolk sac get used up, and the yolk sac and vitelline duct shrink and eventually disappear. The allantois degenerates into a fibrous structure called the urachus that remains attached to the urinary bladder. Alright, as a quick recap, the 4 fetal membranes that develop in order to support and nourish the developing fetus include the amnion, the yolk sac, the chorion, and the allantois. The chorion and the amnion form the amniotic sac, which is filled with amniotic fluid in which the fetus is suspended by the umbilical cord. The chorion also forms the fetal part of the placenta, helping in the exchange of nutrients, waste products, and gases between the fetus and the mother. The allantois, along with the vitelline duct of the yolk sac, are incorporated into the umbilical cord, but degenerate early in pregnancy.